The early Israelites worshipped El by many names: El Shaddai, or El of the Mountains, El Olam, or El Everlasting, El Roy, or El Who Sees, and El Elyon, or El Most High, to name a few. And while it may seem incongruous that the Israelites living in Canaan would have so eagerly adopted a Canaanite god as their own, the influence of Canaanite theology runs deep in the Bible. So deep, in fact, that it isn't always so easy to draw a clear distinction ethnically, culturally, or even religiously between the Canaanites and the Israelites, certainly not in the early history of Israel. The traditional view of the Israelite people is that they were strict monotheists, dedicated to the one and only God of the universe, surrounded on all sides by the polytheistic Canaanites and their false gods. This view does not stand up to historical and archaeological scrutiny. To begin with, there was no single group called the Canaanites. The term is a general designation for all of the various tribes who inhabited the highlands, valleys, and coastal regions of the land of Canaan, the southern Levant, comprising parts of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel-Palestine. That has made it next to impossible to cleanly single out Israelite culture, however that is defined, from the larger umbrella of Canaanite culture. Many scholars now believe that the Israelites were of Canaanite stock, expressing a distinct identity that nevertheless remained rooted in Canaanite culture and religion. Both groups were comprised of West Semitic peoples who spoke a similar language, shared a similar script, and held in common similar rites and rituals. They even employed the same religious terminology for their ceremonies and sacrifices, leading to dozens of Canaanite loanwords in the Hebrew language, most of them pertaining to religious matters. And of course, they shared the same God, El. Actually, it may be more accurate to say that the Israelites and Canaanites shared the same gods, because by no stretch of the imagination could the early Israelites be considered monotheistic. At best, they practiced monolatry, meaning they worshipped one god, El, without necessarily denying the existence of the other gods in the Canaanite pantheon. In fact, the Israelites occasionally worshipped those other gods too, especially Baal and Asherah, and to a lesser degree Anat. And while the Bible is replete with passages, mostly composed by the later priestly writer, condemning the worship of all these other gods, those condemnations only prove that these gods were indeed worshipped by the Israelites, both regularly and, as their presence inside the Temple of Jerusalem indicates, officially. King Saul, the first king of Israel, even named two of his sons after the god Baal, Ishbaal and Meribbaal, alongside the son he named after Yahweh, Jehonatan, or Jonathan. All of this is to say that the early Israelites likely viewed their god El pretty much the same way the Canaanites viewed El, as the chief deity presiding over a divine assembly of lower deities, just as Enlil or Amun-Re or Marduk or Zeus or any other high god would. But their allegiance was to the god after whom they were named, El. It was this same El with whom the patriarch Abraham, who lived most of his life in the land of Canaan and who was steeped in Canaanite culture and religion, if not a Canaanite himself, made a covenant in exchange for a promise of fertility, which was, after all, one of El's primary functions. I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 and 6. It was El who asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as a test of his loyalty and faith. El who renewed the covenant with Isaac's son Jacob. You will no longer be called Jacob. Rather, your name will be Israel. Genesis chapter 35, verse 10. And it was in the name of this same El, the El of your father, that Jacob passed the covenant on to his own son Joseph, who, the Bible tells us, was the first of the Israelites to leave Canaan and settle in Egypt, where generations later, his descendants would come into contact with a hitherto unknown Midianite god who called himself Yahweh. Indeed, the story of how monotheism, after centuries of failure and rejection, finally and permanently took root in human spirituality, begins with the story of how the God of Abraham, El, and the God of Moses, Yahweh, gradually merged to become the sole singular deity that we now know as God. After that first encounter with Yahweh in the desert, Moses returned to Egypt with a message for the Israelites. The God of their forefathers, of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, had heard their cry and would soon liberate them from bondage. But the Israelites were unfamiliar with Moses' deity. Even after Moses demonstrated his God's power and persuaded them to follow him back to the land of Midian, that is, the land of the nomads of Yahweh, where the Israelites supposedly encamped after fleeing Egypt, they continued to exhibit little loyalty to this unknown God. As Moses stood atop the mountain of God to receive a new covenant from Yahweh, the Ten Commandments, meant to supplant Abraham's covenant with El, the Israelites down below had already reverted to the worship of Abraham's God, fashioning for themselves an idol in the shape of a golden calf, the primary symbol of El. Writing hundreds of years after the event, the priestly writer tries to reconcile the conflict between these two separate strands in early Israelite belief by having Moses' God explicitly state, "I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself known to them." Yet this claim only highlights the fact that the patriarchs of Israel, in whose memory Yahweh speaks, did not know who Yahweh was. Reconciliation between Yahweh and El would eventually emerge in Israel, though the history of that reconciliation is a bit rockier than the priestly source suggests. It seems that Yahweh devotion entered the land of Canaan from the south and was centered there for much of its existence. In the northern regions of Canaan, the Israelites who had been living in the land for generations worshipped El as their high god, while also acknowledging and on occasion worshipping the other gods of Canaan. It wasn't too difficult, therefore, for them to simply add Yahweh into the mix, though, as the Bible indicates, this occurred slowly and in stages. We can catch a glimpse of this gradual process in the so-called Song of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. When Elion gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he fixed the borders of the people in accordance with the number of the gods. Yahweh's own portion was his people. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. This extraordinary passage not only affirms Israel's recognition of other gods under El's rule, it clearly casts Yahweh as one of those gods. It states that each deity received as a gift or portion from El its own nation, and that Yahweh's gift was the nation of Israel. When the nation of Israel became the kingdom of Israel, around 1050 BCE, the merging of Yahweh and El was reinforced. Even their names were occasionally fused together as Yahweh El or Yahweh Elohim, presented in most English translations of the Bible as the Lord God. My son, give glory to the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, of Israel. Give thanks to him, and tell me what you have done. Joshua chapter 7, verse 19.
All the born beliefs of the mind. But what's real and what's right has so little to do with those minds.